Committee on Rules will come to order. This is a reconvening of the committee to consider amendments on defense appropriations bills. We have our first panel today, comprised of Mr. Rooney from Florida, Mr. Whitman from Virginia, Mr. Jones from North Carolina, Ms. Lee from California, and Ms. Bordello from Guam. So we'll never forget that you're from Guam. We welcome you all here today. We had a spirited debate yesterday. I have no opening remarks. Do you, Doctor?
None.
There you go.
All right.
I believe in letting ladies go first. Ms. Bordello, we will go with you. You are recognized. Turn your mic, please.
Thank you, Chairman Sessions and Ranking Member McGovern. And thank you to all the members of the Rules Committee for your time today. My amendment provides funding to charter a dry dock for depot-level ship maintenance in the Western Pacific region. Mr. Chairman, over 60% of our Navy surface fleet operates in the Pacific region, driving former Pacific Command Commander Admiral Harris to describe a regional dry dock capability in the Western Pacific as both critical and very necessary. The Pacific area of responsibility is comprised of vast ocean expanses. It includes a multitude of allies and adversaries, driving numerous geographic, diplomatic, and economic factors of vital importance to the national interests of the United States. Mr. Chairman, there is a significant backlog in depot maintenance of our entire Navy fleet, in some cases up to 31 months. A dry dock in the Western Pacific will help alleviate some of this backlog and is common sense from a strategic and operational and economic perspective. A dry dock in the region will allow the Navy to keep critical assets forward in the area of operation to save millions of dollars, transit costs, returning to Hawaii or the contiguous 48 states, and reduce fatigue on our sailors. But most importantly, having a dry dock in the region assures that the personnel and the facilities to support this critical capability will be available when we need it most, during times of tension, which has happened, and hostilities with peer competitors. There is no worse feeling than reaching for a critical capability only to find it missing because we failed to adequately plan for and posture our force. The House Armed Services Committee understood this critical need and authorized full funding in H.R. 5515, which is the National Defense Authorization Act for 2019. This moderate cost is negligible, given how critical this capability is. So I urge the committee to carefully consider the impact of not having a depot-level maintenance capability when our forces need it most, and ask that you support my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bordello. Ms. Lee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank yourself and our ranking member and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify on my amendment to the FY 2019 Defense Appropriations Act. I have one amendment this year, which I respectfully urge you to make in order. My bipartisan amendment, this is lead number 38. It's co-sponsored by my friend, Congressman Walter Jones, Mr. Amash McGovern, Adam Schiff, Welch, Cicilline, and Ellison. It would sunset the overly broad 2001 AUMF after a period of 8 months. That's after enactment of this act. While it's in place, it gives Congress and the administration plenty of time to vote and debate on a new AUMF. I've been in front of this committee many times requesting and urging our body to do our job and debate matters of war and peace. This amendment is not only necessary, it is very timely. We know that on September 14, 2001, the authorization then, it was 60 words. It was a blank check to wage war. I couldn't support it then. It was the wording, from what I remember, is the president's authorized to use force anytime, anywhere, at any point, as long as it was connected to 9/11. It was a blank check. And so in the last 17 years, it's been increasingly clear that the AUMF has essentially provided the president, and that's any president, the authority to wage war in perpetuity. Our brave servicemen and women, they're deployed around the world. We, Congress, is missing in action. Our failure to debate and vote on these wars, it's a betrayal of the American people and our constitutional duty. Now, according to an updated 2018 Congressional Research Report, this is a declassified report, which I would urge you to read. The 2001 AUMF has been used as a blank check it's cited, I think, 41 times in 18 countries to wage war with little or no congressional oversight. In fact, we don't know where many of these wars are taking place. The report in 2016 cited 37 times in 15 countries. So this AUMF is increasingly being used throughout the world. The report, as I said, looks at unclassified incidents. I don't know how many times it's been used without the knowledge of Congress or the American people. No one knows. Not only has this authorization been used to justify military action thousands of miles away, it's also used much closer at home to allow warrantless surveillance and wiretaps, targeted killing by drones, including American citizens, and the open-ended expansion of military operations abroad. In addition, this AUMF has reportedly been invoked to deploy troops in 7 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and Niger. Right now, we know that, as I said, any president can unilaterally wage war under the outdated 2001 authorization. The last 2 presidents, of course, have bombed the Middle East and Africa. President Trump is following in their footsteps, no different. The administration is engaged in a proxy war in Yemen, has expanded our presence in places like in Somalia and Niger. We've sent 3,000 troops, this administration has, additional U.S. troops to Afghanistan and hundreds more to fight ISIS in Syria. Now, Mr. Chairman, I know that while we may not share a common position on the replacement of the 2001 AUMF, many of us do agree that the overly broad authority is a major and concerning deterioration of congressional oversight and war-making authority. And I think many of us can also agree that a robust debate and vote is necessary. It's long overdue, and it must take place. And as you remember from last year in the Appropriations Committee, we voted in a bipartisan fashion to adopt this same amendment, sunsetting the 2001 AUMF after 8 months of the bill's passage, leaving plenty of time to debate and vote on a new one. In 2001, this blank check, this AUMF, it was passed in 3 days. 3 days, that's all it took to write this authorization. And only about 20% of today's Congress was serving when we cast that vote, 20%. Now, given the bipartisan support for my amendment, it was disappointing that last year leadership stripped the amendment from this bill in the dead of the night. It never even made it to the Rules Committee. The bill, I believe, was 326 pages long, and that was the only section that was just lifted out of the bill before it got here. This is an abdication of Congress's constitutional responsibility, and we need to step up and do our job. Next year will mark 18 years of war. That means that our young, brave service members who might be deployed to Afghanistan will not have been born when the 2001 AUMF passed. This is entirely too long for our body to continue to abdicate our constitutional duty. That's why my amendment to sunset the 2001 after a period of 8 months, it's so important. Our brave servicemen and women, they deserve this. They need to know we have their back. They need to know, and the public actually needs to know the costs and consequences of what we're doing throughout the world. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Mr. Whitman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Byrne, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the committee. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present to you today my amendment number 16, which would allow for the dual buy of aircraft carriers, to buy them 2 at a time. We know that this is part of effective and cost-efficient procurement for aircraft carriers. It is a situation where we would ask to lift the limiting language that says CVN 80, limiting it to just purchasing one, to allowing CVN 80 and 81 to be purchased, again, based upon efforts underway to look at efficiencies in buying aircraft carriers. This amendment is a perfecting amendment. The parliamentarian has ruled on that, so there's not an issue as far as procedures. The Congressional Budget Office has ruled that this is a zero cost to the appropriations process, so there's no cost associated with it, and we believe there, both for the parliamentarian and by CBO, It scores at a 0 for cost and is a perfecting amendment, so it doesn't change the underlying bill language. Bottom line is this: the Navy needs more aircraft carriers. We're going to be purchasing them. We have purchased them 2 at a time previously. That makes sense. It allows us to buy them more efficiently. We know that just with the shipbuilder, if we buy 2, we can save about $1.6 billion just in the construction cost. We know with government-supplied equipment, we can save probably closer to $2 billion when we buy them 2 at a time. We can also manage workforce better because we can now build them at the right build rate. We all know a lot of this is based on personnel. So as you ramp up personnel, if you don't have the next ship to go to, you get rid of personnel. That is inefficient. It costs the shipyards more. Those are skilled workers that we need there in the shipyards. We know that there's a better way to do this. Allowing us to buy 2 aircraft carriers at a time puts us in that sweet spot on efficiency. It helps us reduce cost. It gets us the aircraft carriers that we need, and it has widespread support. We were able to gather 131 signatures of House members that was presented to Secretary Mattis in December of 2017 as they looked at the dual buy of aircraft carriers. They look at it and also believe that it makes sense. We know, too, that this provision was in this year's NDAA that passed out of the House on a vote of 351 to 66. So it has widespread support, so I beg for the committee's consideration of this to have it put into the amendments that are allowed to be debated on the floor. I think it's something that's needed. We have done this in the past. We have shown that this is the most efficient way, the best way for us to go about purchasing this. And this just gives the authority to the Navy to do this as they continue to look at the efficiencies that can be gained by building these aircraft carriers 2 at a time. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to come before you today. I want to let you know, too, that Mr. Joe Courtney, who is my compatriot on the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, is here today. He's a co-sponsor of this, along with 20 other members that have co-sponsored this amendment. I also want to speak, too, before Mr. Courtney gets up here, I'm also a co-sponsor of his amendment on submarines, and I'm strongly in favor of that, which is an amendment similar to this in how we do things in the most efficient way possible. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence and beg for your support.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Mr. Rooney, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to speak before you about Amendment 67 by Congressman Castor, prohibiting funds going to explore or drill in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. I represent a united and solidified Florida delegation in support of this proposal. Our 27-person delegation is the 3rd largest in the House, and we have 21 million Americans living in Florida, the 3rd most populous state. Here's an opportunity for you to protect Florida from the existential threat which offshore drilling poses to our tourism and recreational economy. Like the legal canon, to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, conditions and circumstances which could, however distant or mistakenly, give rise to the possibility of an adverse impact on the west coast of Florida as a result of drilling and exploration in the eastern Gulf create an unjustified and existential threat to us. As noted in the recently published book, The Gulf, which I recommend, as the post-war era began, the eastern Gulf pursued a leisure economy, the western Gulf an industrial one. People inundated one coast, chemical plants the other. With our tourism economy, we are radically different from the northern and western Gulf, but deserve protection from damage just as much. In addition to the risk to our economy, we don't need to take this risk to be energy secure anymore. By the industry's own admission, there isn't that much to find in the eastern Gulf in light of other discoveries around the world, and in the United States and northern hemisphere are destined to be energy independent in the near future, as the western hemisphere already is energy independent. Horizontal drilling technology, which can make a horizontal well bore over 2 miles long within a 50-foot band, combined with hydraulic fracking technology, which imposes water and chemicals into the shale beds to open them up, have revolutionized the industry. In the Permian Basin alone in West Texas, there are 3 shale zones. Just one of them, the Wolfcamp, is said to contain 20 billion barrels of oil that are recoverable. Yes, billion. We have more reserves in the U.S. now than Russia or Saudi Arabia have conventional reserves. Last time you all indulged me to speak before you, I presented charts of the projected changes in import and export routes of hydrocarbons around the world now and in 2020, showing the radical shift to independence. As the CEO of Shell noted in Fortune magazine in January 2018, global demand for gasoline and diesel fuel will peak as early as a decade from now, and certainly by 2030. A May 25, 2017 article in a science blog, Perspicacity, entitled How Big Oil Will Die, asserts that peak oil demand will occur by 2022, and notes that the Keystone Pipeline, a favorite cause in the 2012 election, has been shut in now because the high-cost Canadian tar sands are no longer economic. In an era of rapid technological change in the electronic vehicle market, we should recall the fate of Kodak cameras and Nokia smartphones. PPHB, a Houston energy investment bank, recently commented in its monthly newsletter that the electronic vehicle business will be growing at an accelerated rate over the next few years. Like the CEO of Shell, they get it. Any leasing undertaken after the existing Gomesa moratorium expires in June of 2022 would not even be in production before massive decarbonization sets in. Shell's latest Gulf of Mexico project, Vito, was first designed as a 40,000-ton platform in 2014, but has been downsized to 8,900 tons right now. In fact, inside the company, there's a great amount of internal debate of whether ever to build it. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, with humans and mechanical technology involved, things can always go haywire, despite taking the best of precautions. Right now, the Department of Interior is trying to water down the enhanced safety regulations put in place after the Deepwater Horizon spill. The Florida delegation recently wrote Secretary Zinke in united opposition to this unfortunate move. The Gulf Restoration Network recently published a study of current spills going on right now, caused by such reputable firms as Shell Oil and LOGG. One spill, the Taylor, has been leaking continually for 13 years. Just last year, a spill of 400,000 barrels occurred at an oil well pipeline hookup. Lastly, drilling itself puts massive amounts of drilling fluids and mud, especially bentonite and other harmful chemicals, into the surrounding waters. Testing of the water around offshore well bores consistently shows high amounts of harmful trace metals. So lastly, in closing, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak before you and implore you to please protect Florida by prohibiting the exploration and drilling in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rooney. Mr. Jones, you're recognized.
Chairman, thank you very much. I'll be brief because Ms. Lee did a great job of explaining the need for this amendment. I want to say that I joined her because of my many years of frustration that we've had no debate on a new AMF or a debate on Afghanistan. To me, if the least we can do when we take the oath of office is to make sure that our men and women in uniform are remembered. It's sad to me that here we are asking that this Lee amendment, which I'm a co-sponsor, and others in the House, that we're asking for 10 minutes of debate. Our men and women are worth more than 10 minutes. But if that's all we can get, then please give us 10 minutes of a debate. As you know better than I, it's 5 minutes each side. They're dying for us overseas. Not as frequently as they used to, but they're still dying. Right here is an article in the Washington Post where the father of an Army guy killed said, "Why are we still in Afghanistan?" His 22-year-old son was shot and killed in Afghanistan. The least we can do is to give the House an opportunity for a 10-minute debate on the Lee Amendment. It's been, as she said, over 17 years ago that we had our debate in 2001. Give us 10 minutes. Is all we ask for the future of our military to have this debate. Last point, very quickly. I'm going to read very quickly, Mr. Chairman, because I know we've got to go. The former Commandant of the Marine Corps, Chuck Krulak, has been my advisor on Afghanistan for 5 years. He was the 31st Commandant of the Marine Corps. Afghanistan cannot be viewed through the lens of a true nation state or a true country. It is fragmented, tribal, controlled by warlords, economically a basket case, no real government outside of Kabul, and that is questionable. A poorly organized and led army who will shoot at Americans as well as the enemy, with no sense of what the country needs to be. This is the key point for this committee. No one has ever conquered Afghanistan, and many have tried. We will join the list of nations that have tried and failed. It is a waste of life and money to be in Afghanistan. Give the Lee Amendment a chance. to have 10 minutes to debate for our men and women in uniform so they won't die for nothing. So I ask you to please consider the Lee Jones Amendment and everyone else who has co-sponsored this. Give us 10 minutes. I yield back.
Thank you. They have called votes, but we'd like to get through this panel if at all possible, and so I'm going to be very brief. Mr. Bordell, you know how strongly I share your feelings about Guam, so I certainly hear what you're saying. Mr. Whitman, I'm a member of your subcommittee. I know the arguments that you've made very well, and I appreciate you and Mr. Courtney's leadership on it. Mr. Rooney left, but I live on the Gulf of Mexico, too. We often talk about having two coasts. We have more than two coasts. We have the Gulf Coast. We have a coast around Guam, around Hawaii, around Puerto Rico. We're proud of all those coasts. On the AUMF, I share both of your views on this. I think that we should have a new AUMF. I don't know how we're going to handle it this particular time, but I'm going to continue to sponsor versions of the AUMF and try to use my voice where I can. But you did say something I want to make sure that I clarified about. We do know all the countries where we have our troops. You have to find out about them in classified sessions. That's by necessity. If you'd like for me to help you set up those classified briefings, I'd be happy for you to. I've got to be honest with you. I had to go hunt them out myself, so it wasn't like it was that easy to find, but I was able to find, and I think you can find for yourself where they are.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I also think that the public needs to understand, and I understand the classified nature of some of the information, but what I don't understand is when we send our young men and women into war, the public needs to understand the costs and consequences and where they're sent into harm's way.
Well, I'd be happy to work with you on that if you think that'd be helpful. The gentleman from Georgia, any questions? Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you for coming. I support making all your amendments in order. I think they're all good amendments. And I just want to associate myself with Mr. Jones and Ms. Lee. I want to say something for the record. You mentioned that your language in the Defense Appropriations Bill on the AUMF, sunsetting it, didn't make it to rules. It did make it to rules. This committee eliminated it. So this committee has been complicit time and time and time again in terms of denying members of both parties the right to be able to have this vote. And we hear all the speeches about how we ought to debate an AUMF and how we honor our men and women who are serving over in Afghanistan, and yet time and time and time again, every time there is an amendment dealing with an AUMF, this committee, the Rules Committee, blocks it. Maybe this time will be different, but I think I think the fact that the House of Representatives won't debate this issue, I think is moral cowardice. I really do. I cannot understand for the life of me. There's always an excuse. Well, it's the Foreign Affairs Committee. Should be this committee. Should be that committee. Doesn't matter. We ought to have that debate. If people want to vote no, they can vote no. But this committee should stop blocking a legitimate debate on this issue. I thank you all. I yield back.
The gentleman from the state of Washington. No questions. Gentleman has no questions. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I support making all of the amendments in order, including the one that Mr. Courtney hasn't testified yet about, but I support it as well. I think it's vital, and I've had an opportunity to talk with Joe about that. I've been an advocate. You on that too, Denny? I support your amendment as well. So you all don't even have to testify, but Ms. Lee and Mr. Jones, when managing the rule today, I brought up the fact that the ranking member just brought up, and the chair, regarding the AUMF and how important it is. And so Mr. Rooney left, and I don't think he knew that he needed to stay here, but he left me as one of those 27 Floridians that united in opposition to any drilling off of the east coast of the Gulf. And he has been a dynamic leader in that, and I, for one, deeply appreciate it. But I support all of your amendments.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Wyoming. She has no questions. The gentlewoman from California. Good. Good. Brevity is the soul of wit. Good. Thank you all. We appreciate your attendance today. The committee will now stand in recess pending call of the chair so we can go vote.
Rules Committee to come back to order. Thank you very much for joining us. The panel that we're going to move forward on still is concerning H.R. 6157, Department of Defense Appropriations Act of 2019. Gentlemen, welcome. I'm delighted that you're here. As always, anything you brought in writing, we appreciate leaving with our stenographers. Those who will, without objection, be entered in the record. Thank you very much. Mr. Rohrabacher, are you prepared to proceed? The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee. And I thank Mr. Rohrabacher. I was right on the cusp of doing this before the last vote series, so I appreciate him letting me finish the agenda that was there before. So again, amendment number 23, it's an amendment to basically reinsert the NDAA provision regarding submarine construction. It provided funding for long lead items that go into the 5-year process of building submarines. It is one reactor that is funded. Again, at the time that it was passed in the NDAA, we scrubbed and rescrubbed the pay-fors that, again, make this amendment not just budget neutral, but actually budget positive. It's a little slight extra savings for the overall fiscal budget. I handed out a chart which shows really the dilemma that we face right now as a nation, which is that our submarine force level, which is at 53 attack submarines today, is going down to 42. Even with the 2-a-year build rate, which is in the appropriations base bill, that's, again, that was reported out by the Appropriations Committee. So what this amendment does is basically give the Navy the flexibility today to negotiate the next block contract for submarines, which is actually happening in real time. That's probably going to conclude sometime at the end of this year. Again, they do it in 5-year increments. And so this is a critical time in terms of whether or not the Navy's going to have the tools to stop this decline in the fleet of a critical platform for our country. As Congresswoman Cheney can attest, the combatant commanders that have appeared before the Armed Services Committee, whether it was Admiral Harris in Asia Pacific, General Scaparrotti in the North Atlantic, have reiterated over and over again that even with the 53 submarine fleet today, that they are not able to satisfy mission requests. And again, that environment is getting more and more competitive in the undersea domain. So what this amendment seeks to do is to listen to what the combatant commanders have said, to give the Navy the flexibility to negotiate a slightly larger block buy than what was in the Appropriations Committee, and again, mitigate this decline in the fleet size of a platform, which, again, is the great equalizer, certainly in the undersea domain. It's the one area that we still predominate, but China and Russia is moving fast in terms of building up their capacity. This is an amendment that's been endorsed by the last 2 CNOs. Chief of Naval Operations Greenert and Roughhead have submitted letters in support of it. Admiral Natter is one of the most decorated admirals in America today. Again, used to be commander of the 7th Fleet, has endorsed it, as well as Admiral Mike Connor, who was the head of Subforce Atlantic before. The Navy League has endorsed it, and the Metal Trades Department of the AFL-CIO has also endorsed it. So again, we're just wanting to, again, ask the Rules Committee to let us have a vote. And again, I appreciate the time and consideration to make our presentation. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Would this be considered the same as amendment number 23, Mr.
That's my
Whitman?
amendment. Yes, Rob is co-sponsor. There actually are 23 bipartisan co-sponsors on the amendment.
I see that. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Mr. Rohrabacher, are you prepared to speak? I do confess I was out speaking about exactly this amendment when this committee opened up, and it's continuing dialogue, and I appreciate your help. The gentleman from California.
Well, thank you very much. I have an amendment here that basically it's an amendment that deals with our relations with Egypt. And on March 31st, 2015,
Does the gentleman have
Yes.
a number of the amendment?
Let's see, is this the number that they're talking about?
This says print 115-77.
115-77.
Yeah, so it must be 77.
So it must be 77.
Yeah. 26, okay, thank you.
26, all right.
Yes, number 26 makes funds available to Egypt through cash flow financing.
Right.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Judge.
Okay.
Gentleman's recognized.
Okay. On March 31st, 2015, President Obama announced that the United States would stop offering to Egypt cash flow military financing, or CFF. Up to that point, Egypt might pay 20% down and 20% annually for 4 years to purchase the weapon system that it needed. This approach then permitted Egypt for immediate use of military equipment that they deemed necessary for the security of their country. And my amendment restores CFF for Egypt. It will ensure that Egypt will have what it needs to defeat those evil forces in the Middle East that not only threaten Egypt, but also the United States and the peace of the world. The fact is that if indeed we hold off until if we make them pay cash in the barrelhead, they may not be able to afford the weapon system at all. And the fact is that weapon system may be pivotal to securing the entire Middle East. Egypt plays that most important role. And if we know if El-Sisi falls, radical Islamic terrorism will just have, it'll be unstoppable. Thus, I think Egypt deserves to have this type of financing available to them. It was available to them before, and I have met with President El-Sisi himself, and when asked what was the most important thing we could do to help Egypt defeat radical Islamic terrorists, he said, get me back that cash flow financing so we don't have to pay everything right up front and can use the weapons as we pay for them. And so that's my pitch.
Thank you very much. Mr. Heck, welcome to the Rules Committee. If you'll please just give us an idea about the number of the amendments as you speak about it, and the distinguished gentleman be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I am here in support of amendment number 35.
Thank you.
And grateful to be so. As I've said to this committee before, I have the great honor to represent the 10th Congressional District of Washington State, which includes within it Joint Base Lewis-McChord, one of the largest military installations in America, and to which more than 50,000 people per day report to work. And many of them get there by using portion of Interstate 5, which is the most heavily traveled north-south freight corridor in the state of Washington. Surrounding roads play a pretty important role in our overall readiness. Obviously, our armed forces need to mobilize quickly when it comes time to get to the base, and we need functional roads in order to do that. If they're caught in a jam, efficiency goes out the window and out the door, and the domino effect delays due to congestion, frankly, impairs our national security. So first and foremost, I would suggest this is a readiness amendment. But it's not just readiness that is stranded, as it were. Commerce is also stranded as a consequence of congestion on roads in and around military installations, especially those military installations that have rapidly grown. Our own, for example, has more than doubled in size in just the last 20 years. So it's had a cascading effect, frankly, and materially affects businesses in that regard. I'm not suggesting nor implying that the military is to blame for this. In fact, they've come up with some pretty innovative ways to ease the pain upon the surrounding communities. But there's no question whatsoever that large military installations that have grown rapidly do, in fact, affect the surrounding communities. And we need more than a Band-Aid over this wound. We need some help. So what does this amendment do? It funds the Defense Community Infrastructure Program under the Office of Economic Adjustment. This year, the House Armed Services Committee, through the NDAA, authorized $100 million for this program, although obviously no money has been appropriated for it yet. The Defense Community Infrastructure Program is grant-based for the federal government to assist state and local governments who have been significantly impacted in their infrastructure due to their proximity to a military installation. And there is a match requirement that is included in this program as authorized by the NDAA. This amendment would not fund the entire amount that's authorized, which again is $100 million. It would only provide for $36 million in grants for these various infrastructure projects. The CBO has scored this amendment to have no budgetary effect, does not change the outlays in the bill. The amendment's increase is offset by reducing the funding for the administration of the Office of SecDef by 2%. Not something I propose lightly. He's, as we say on the street, a homie, and I happen to be a fan of Secretary Mattis. But the fact of the matter is, $36 million out of more than $1.5 billion for this important program is desperately needed. And it is, I might add, something that's just not my idea on my own. This particular program is authorized in the NDAA as a iteration on a bill that I have introduced with significant bipartisan support in recent sessions, and it is strongly supported by the Association of Defense Communities. This is an organization that represents 250 communities in and around military installations throughout the country, and this is a strong priority of them. And as a consequence of the importance it is to the communities, as a consequence of my belief that this would aid in military readiness, I strongly urge the members of this committee to rule the amendment in order so that the House can fund this important program. With that, I thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rohrabacher, the battle in the Middle East does come through Egypt in many respects. And they are our friend, and we have treated them well, and they've treated us well. Is this something that state understands also? You've worked with them on, and we understand what we're doing?
I've had numerous conversations with high-level military officials in Egypt, but also with General Sisi, or now President El-Sisi.
Yes, sir.
And this was the number one issue that could help them make their country more secure and more likely to defeat these radical Islamic terrorists. That they have focused on this regime. They know if Egypt falls, there's going to be there will be no stability in the Middle East from that point on.
Well, I've met with President Sisi also and concur with you. And I appreciate it. You and I have a chance almost every morning to greet each other and to speak about a number of issues. And I want to thank you for your view of the world, and I appreciate you very much. Chairman Cole?
Just a couple of quick questions. I want to associate myself with your remarks about my good friend from California, and I think it's an important issue that he raises, and we don't have a lot of friends, so when you've got one, and this was one that has helped us keep the peace for a very long time in a very tough region, has been a very responsible actor. It's something we ought to look at. My friend from Connecticut, if you would tell me, I mean, every time we move something, obviously you got it offset. I'd like to know what the offsets are.
So there's a number of them, and I don't want to, bore people and take it, but number one, just as I mentioned earlier, every single one of these was incorporated into the National Defense Authorization Act.
Well,
The biggest item was the reduction in the OMB's request regarding the DDG Flight 3 class destroyers, okay, which again, that's going to be a 3-ship block buy. This is the 4th, 5th, and 6th of that class that is going to be constructed. The OMB request assumed $1.8 million per ship, okay, which is exactly the same price which the first-in-class cost. And you've been around long enough to know that as platforms, move further into development, that the cost per unit comes down, just because there's a learning curve that comes with it. So NDAA took about $300 million off that total top line for the 3 ships, whatever 3 times 1.8 million is, okay? And again, there was no pushback or objection from the Navy, at the time that was done, okay? So we actually used a smaller offset, about 246, so it's about 80 million per ship. And again, it does not affect the fact that there's 3 destroyers that was in the President's request, that were authorized by the NDAA and are being appropriated in this bill, and that is unchanged. We're not cutting a ship, but we are doing is recognizing what I think most people who testified before the committee said would be savings that would be easily achieved. There is no cuts to any tails, no planes that are cut in this amendment, even though there's been some noise to that effect out there. And again, I know Mrs. Granger boosted the F-35 buy, which, in Connecticut, we make the engines for those, so, no argument there. And again, there's no impact in terms of the F-35.
I can't interrupt and just ask specifically in that area, this is helpful information.
Yes.
So thank you. Do you happen to know if there's any cuts to the KC-46 tanker?
There's not.
Okay,
And
that's
again,
helpful.
this is another engine program which takes place in Mr. Larson's district in Connecticut. So we watch that one pretty closely. Okay, so again, I went through the DDG, the MK-54 torpedo program. We took $10 million out of that, which was because it was assessed as excess cost growth in the program. Again, no complaint, no pushback from the Navy. Okay, the carrier replacement program, which again was another excess cost growth for the Bush, because again, these programs are maturing, so the excess cost growth that was programmed in is unnecessary. And as I've noted, Mr. Whitman is a co-sponsor of this. If he really thought carriers were being negatively impacted, I'm sure he would have, no way he would have supported a change to that effect. The TAO fleet oilers, those are the fleet, the oiler ships. Again, there was a $20 million reduction. Again, this is ships later in the program, which the Appropriations Committee bill, again, is still funding at the initial price tag. And again, those are being built out at NASCO, and they're doing great things in terms of bringing down the cost per unit. Again, no pushback in terms of what came back from that. The let's see here, there's a couple others that are in here. So the RQ4 post-production charges, those are the unmanned drones. Again, those, there's a reduction of $30 million. This is post-production excess cost growth. Northrop Grumman is, that's their bailiwick. Again, no pushback on that because, by the way, that's out years that we're talking about here. So it's not there's not a needs requirement that, again, our committee asked. Sort of determined there. The special purpose vehicles, which are not tactical vehicles, those are the sort of transport vehicles for VIPs. Again, there was a reduction in that program of $21 million. Again, there was no pushback from the Pentagon on that issue. And the next gen air dominance program, which is the 6th generation fighter aircraft, this is the post F-35 program. We're talking way out there in terms of years. There was a $40 million reduction that was there. So again, taking all those pieces together, which had already been vetted through the NDAA process, combined will pay for that long lead reactor so that we can build what I think is just a very critical platform for our Navy.
I appreciate it. It's extremely helpful. Yep. Thank you very much. Mr. Heck, just out of curiosity, did you ask your hometown guy if he was okay with the 2% you were snipping his budget?
No.
Okay. Just curious. Just curious. The problem I know, and I haven't talked to Ms. Granger about any of these things, that with all due respect to my friends that authorize, they quite often authorize more money than we allocate. Or, so she's in there making tough choices. But I appreciate the testimony as always. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman of
I
Massachusetts.
just want to thank all of you for being here. I hope your amendments are made in order. And Mr. Cornier, as a peacenik who's been, critical of a lot of our defense spending, let me just say I support your amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Distinguished gentleman of Georgia. No questions. Gentleman does not seek time. Gentleman from Florida.
I have no questions. I support all the amendments, and I've already made Mr. Heck's and Mr. Courtney's amendment in order in your absence.
I appreciate that, Judge. A lot of wisdom when I'm not around, right? We do have fun up here.
It's nice to see.
Yes, sir. Distinguished gentleman from Louisville, Texas, does not seek time. Distinguished gentleman from the state of Washington.
Well, I would just acknowledge that my friend, Mr. Heck, from the state of Washington, has a very legitimate concern with the traffic issues around Joint Base Lewis McChord, and I've driven that stretch of I-5 numerous occasions. Definitely need some help there, so I appreciate him bringing the issue to us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Distinguished gentleman from Freedom, Colorado. No questions. Gentleman does not seek time. Is there any other member that would seek time with this panel? Gentlemen, thank you very much. Mr. Courtney, I'll tell you, you've been part of an intense discussion, and I want to say that I count on my dear friend Tom Cole more than probably he wants me to count on him. And Tom has an interest in making sure that our military gets what they need, feels very strongly about the work that he does, and I think that this continued dialogue and discussion that you had was most instructive to Chairman Cole and myself, and I want to thank you for the facts and the professional analysis that you provided. Yes, sir. Thank you. Sir, thank you very much. Okay, we're going to continue on. I see at least one member. I'm not sure I see two, but I see Ms. Washington Schultz. And then we will move to the, yes, ma'am, please join us. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Can I just ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the statements of Mr. Langevin, Ms. Jackson Lee, and Mr. Doggett?
Without objection, those will be in the record. Thank
Following
you.
the same line, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
And save us some time, if I could just introduce or ask unanimous consent that Ms. Torres's statement in support of her amendment be made in order, and I submit my statement for the record and ask unanimous consent that we go forward in that manner.
Judge Hastings, thank you. Without objection, we'll enter those record, and thank you very much. We will go to committee members immediately next. We're delighted that you're joining us. Last time when you were here the other day, you really gave us a wonderful discussion about how working together works. So distinguished gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm here to, although express concern, it is in a similar vein as far as the spirit of cooperation, not only amongst our members here in Congress, but between the branches of government, which is why I'm here to respectfully ask that my amendment be made in order so that Congress can perform its constitutional oversight duties. My colleagues, as we meet here today, I know we have witnessed young children who were stripped from their parents' arms and who are still being held behind locked doors. In recent days, we've had horrific allegations of verbal and physical abuse at child detention facilities, including racial slurs, forced injections of medically inappropriate drugs, children being tied to chairs without being allowed to go to the bathroom, and kids being punched, kicked, and sexually assaulted. These are heinous acts that allegedly have been perpetrated by our own government with funds appropriated by this Congress. Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and even though the executive branch created this humanitarian crisis, we have the power to stop these atrocities. I'd like to bring to the committee's attention that over the past week, several of my Florida colleagues and I have had a much too difficult time getting access to child detention facilities in our home state. Last Tuesday, Senator Nelson and I, with at least half a day's notice, and including being told on our way down that we were going to be granted access to the temporary shelter in Homestead, Florida, housing children who came across the border as both unaccompanied minors as well as children separated from their parents involuntarily. When we arrived, we were told if we took another step that we would be considered trespassing. Now, all we were there to do was to tour the facility and to be able to exercise our constitutional oversight role, because we do appropriate the funds for these facilities, and we are a co-equal branch of government. As I explained to Secretary Hargan the other day on the phone, who described to me what he believed was his oversight role, he thankfully agreed with me that, that Congress also has an oversight role, and we shouldn't have to beg and plead in order to perform our constitutional oversight role. No administration should be allowed to string members of Congress along to buy time to cover up any abuses before granting access. Now, Mr. Chairman and members, 5 days later, Senator Nelson and several other members and I were granted access to the Homestead facility. And when I arrived there and toured the facility and saw the children, they certainly were treated adequately. It was a bare bones, militaristic style facility, not a place that you'd want your children, and I certainly wouldn't want my children to have to stay at a place like that. But I was struck with the notion that I was not sure if this is the way the facility looked, why they couldn't have allowed us access on Tuesday and what did it look like on Tuesday, 5 days before that. What is the Trump administration hiding? I'm not the only member that was denied access to these facilities. Some ridiculous declaration that we have to give them 2 weeks' notice to be granted access to tour a facility and to ask questions of the staff and to simply observe what's going on in these facilities. Now, last week's executive order stopping family separations, at least temporarily, was a small step in the right direction, not related to this, unfortunately. But the Trump administration is clearly not doing nearly enough to reunite children with their parents, and many other children remain in detention facilities throughout the country. But Congress must be able to verify what is actually happening to children in U.S. custody and must closely oversee the process of reuniting children with their parents. This administration, Mr. Chairman, has shown time and time again that it cannot be trusted. Decades from now, when my grandchildren, my future grandchildren, because I don't have any now, ask me what I did to help save those innocent kids from the cruelty that they are facing from the Trump administration, I want to be able to tell them that I did every single thing I could to end that suffering. Each and every one of us has to ask ourselves the very same question. What do we do to stop this horrific crime that is occurring against children in our nation? But ultimately, this is not about us. It's about those kids crying out for their parents, not knowing when or if they'll ever see them again. It's about those parents who fled unbearable circumstances only to encounter a cruel Trump policy, intentionally making their lives even more unbearable. Mr. Chairman, I'm here because we absolutely have to stand together to insist that we be allowed as a co-equal branch of government to inspect, tour, and conduct oversight at facilities that we are appropriating funds for, particularly those that are caring for children in the custody of the United States. And so I urge the adoption of this amendment so members of Congress can see for ourselves what is going on. And if things are moving in the right direction, then the Trump administration should have no objection to this amendment. If the Trump administration does object to members of Congress seeing how they are treating children, that makes passage of this amendment all the more urgent. We all like to say to ourselves that had we been in positions of power when atrocities were perpetrated throughout history, that we would have stood up for what was right. My colleagues were in the process of finding out who we really are. Children's lives hang in the balance, and I urge all members of this committee to join together to take action against the suffering, to take action against cruelty, and to take action to ensure that families remain together and all children are treated with compassion, and I urge adoption of my amendment. I urge that my amendment be made in order, to use the vernacular of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judge Hastings?
I support making an amendment in order, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions.
Thank you very much. Any other member of the committee? I've been advised that there's a point of order against the amendment, evidently. Are you aware of that?
I am not aware of that.
Okay. Well, probably we need to search a little bit further to make sure you are, so that you're prepared if the committee were to make that in order, knowing that that could happen on the floor.
This was an amendment, and I would beg the committee's consideration, that was adopted in the State Foreign Ops Appropriations Subcommittee unanimously, accepted by the majority.
Yes, ma'am. All I'm suggesting to you is evidently I've been advised that a point of order would be present on the floor, and all I'm trying to do is advise the gentlewoman. She may want to check on that if this committee were to make that an order.
I'm happy to check. I would at least like the opportunities that we could, because that's a discretionary decision. I'd at least like the opportunity for the amendment to be made in order.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you'll please know that anything you brought in writing would be allowed to be left for the awesome stenographer for allowing her to complete the record. Thank you very much. Okay, we have now, this will be an announcement to the membership. If there's any member that would seek to come give testimony, we're going to move now to any Rules Committee member that would wish to give testimony, and then advise the body that if anybody else is interested, they need to be coming to the Rules Committee. So we're now open for any amendment that would be offered from the committee. Distinguished gentleman, Laura.
I've asked unanimous consent that my statement be made a part of the record, and I support my amendment being made in order, and the same for Ms. Torres, whose statement has been put in the record, and I ask that her amendment be made in order.
Judge, thank you very much. Any other member wish to be heard? Any other member wish to be heard on any amendment that they would bring to the committee? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion, H.R. 6157, Department of Defense Appropriations Act 2019. We are evidently ready to move forward, so distinguished gentleman from Georgia would move a motion. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 200, the Strengthening Fishing Communities and Increasing Flexibility in Fisheries Management Act, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for the purpose of amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources now printed in the bill and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes an order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for the division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report, and finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion, the first motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Is there amendment or discussion to H.R. 200? Seeing none, the vote now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, ayes have it.
Ask for roll call.
Gentleman, ask for roll
Please.
call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole. Mr. Woodall.
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, aye. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings.
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis. Mrs. Torres. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk will
aye.
report the total.
7 yeas, 2 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the chairman is not prepared at this time to announce who will be handling that as manager for Republicans.
Neither are we.
And the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts reserves the same right. Those will be announced at a later meeting. I appreciate the distinguished gentleman. H.R. 200 has now passed. Chairman, now being received a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, H.R. 6157.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a structured rule for further consideration of H.R. 6157, the Department of Defense Appropriations Act of 2019. The rule provides for no additional general debate. The rule makes an order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report and available pro forma amendments described in Section 3 of House Resolution 961. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall not be subject to amendment except amendments described in Section 3 of House Resolution 961, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report, and the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period of June 29, 2018 through July 9, 2018, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. Section 3 of the rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 2. And finally, Section 4 of the rule provides that it shall be in order without intervention of any point of order to consider concurrent resolutions providing for adjournment during the month of July 2018.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Is there amendment or discussion to that?
Mr. Chairman, we have a few amendments here. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the following amendments to H.R. 6157 by Representative Doggett and several other members, numbers 75 and 72. Amendment 75 would prohibit DOD from using funds to provide housing for children who are unaccompanied, including those separated from their parents at the border. Amendment number 72 prohibits DOD from fulfilling any requests from HHS in regards to the care or custody of unaccompanied children, of an unaccompanied child.
Thank you very much. Discussion? Vote now be on the government amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it.
As for roll call?
Gentlemen, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck, Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis. Mrs. Torres. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
2 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion?
I have another amendment, Mr. Chairman. I move the
recognized.
committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the bipartisan amendment offered by Representatives Lee, myself, Jones, Amash, Schiff, Welsh, and Cicilline to H.R. 6157, number 38. This amendment sunsets the 2001 AUMF 240 days after enactment of this bill. This is long overdue. The nearly 17-year-old overly broad AUMF has been treated as a blank check to endlessly wage war, and it represents a severe lack of congressional oversight. Last year, Speaker Ryan undemocratically stripped this provision from the bill. This is our chance to make it right, we do this all the time. This is our opportunity to actually have a debate on the AUMF, and I hope that my colleagues will do that.
Thank you very much. Discussion? I need to notify the gentleman that I had a rather detailed discussion today with the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walter Jones. Mr. Jones and I have, as you and I have, as Judge Hastings has been engaged in this issue for a number of years. Mr. Jones and I had the conversation with a distinguished young chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Royce, and I believe it did yield positive viewpoints from the majority perspective. I want you to know that notwithstanding your ideas that you continue to bring here that are forthright and straightforward, it is not being placed upon deaf ears.
Does that mean that we have a commitment to debate an AUMF on a foreign affairs bill? I mean, are they pledged a time that they will bring a bill to the floor that we have a commitment for a date, or?
I appreciate the question, and this would be a very good question and one that I will answer back, and that is, we have not come to a conclusion. What we came to an agreement on is that we're going to forthrightly engage in the discussion, and I have lent my name to the effort to move the issue.
I appreciate that,
It's
but
a sharp stick.
yeah, with all due respect, that doesn't make me feel very good. We've been having, we've been trying to do this, having this same discussion, been on a merry-go-round for 17 years, so.
Perhaps it wouldn't matter that I gave you an update, but I decided that I felt like it would be fair that I did.
But if you gave me an update that said we have a commitment that it will be brought up, in a time certain, that would be wonderful. But you can't, so I will insist on a vote on this amendment.
I would agree the gentleman should insist on that. Vote for the discussion. Seeing none, the vote now be on the government amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No.
As for roll call.
Those have it. Gentleman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole, Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck, Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings. Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis, Mrs. Torres. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report total.
2 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Any further amendment or discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Distinguished gentleman, floor is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. Move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment offered by Representative Krishnamurthy and 15 of our colleagues, including our Ranking Member McGovern, to H.R. 6157. Number 25. This amendment would prohibit any funds in this bill from being used to enforce President Trump's Family Immigration Detention Executive Order.
Further discussion?
No.
Vote now be on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No.
I ask for a roll call.
Gentleman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins, Mr. Byrne, Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse, Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck, Ms. Cheney, Ms. Cheney, no. Mr. McGovern. Aye. Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings.
Aye.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis, Mrs. Torres, Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report total.
2 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to, not agreed to. Department or discussion.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Distinguished gentleman is recognized.
Just very briefly, I chose not to offer Ms. Wasserman Schultz's amendment in light of what you said about a point of order likely to be sustained against it. So I just have a question, and that's whether or not in the Rules Committee we would have, even if a point of order would be maintained, the prerogative to offer a waiver for amendments, not so much this one, but any amendment.
In fact, you would.
All right. Then I'll leave it as it is. You sent her searching for her answer, and there are going to be some other vehicles. All right.
Yes, sir. I just felt like it'd be forthright. I had not had the opportunity to discuss that with her. Yes, sir. Okay. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Ayes have it, ayes have it. Gentlemen, ask for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? Aye. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Aye. Ms. Cheney? Aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Polis? Mrs. Torres? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk will report the total.
7 yeas, 2 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the distinguished gentlewoman from the state of Wyoming, Mrs. Cheney, will be handling this for Republicans.
And the gentleman from California, Ms. Torres, will be handling it for the
Ms. Torres will
Democrats.
be handling for Democrats. If I could, I'd like to draw the committee's attention just for one moment, please. I would like to engage the clerk for a clarification of the vote on the final request for a recorded vote on H.R. 200. And I would like to have the clerk clarify what he believes the vote should be recorded as.
6 yeas, 2 nays.
Thank you. Please let the record reflect that there was a belief that it was recorded as 7 as opposed to 6. And in fact, we believe that it's been corrected to 6. And I thank the gentleman, the clerk of the committee for.
Does that mean we still lost?
It means.
It was closer.
Yeah, there you go, Tom. Yeah, I mean, yes, yes.
Come back.
So I want to thank the clerk for his forthrightness in preparing that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
So just, what's going on with immigration? Are we off for the night? I mean, are you bringing anything up tomorrow, or do you still, are you guys still trying to figure this out?
I think there's still a figuring out process.
But we're not meeting again tonight.
So at this point, this is our last scheduled meeting for the week.
Oh, good.
It was where we approached the district work period. We asked members to remain flexible. I did not mean to imply there would not be anything.
But it wouldn't be tonight.
What I meant to imply is I do not anticipate anything at this time.
Terrific.
I would like to, if I could, to acknowledge I've got some important interns from my office that are here. James Davis, University of Virginia, Rising Junior, majoring in Foreign Affairs. Megan Harvey, Dallas, Texas, SMU, Rising Junior, majoring in Political Science. J.D. Baja, Dallas, Texas. I thought it was Richardson, but it says Dallas, Texas. University of Texas at Austin, Rising Senior, majoring in Political Science. And Katie Callowert, Miss TCU, Rising Sophomore, majoring in Entrepreneurial Management. I want to thank those interns from my office for appearing at the Rules Committee today. Is there any other business from any other member?
All set.
Seeing none, this now completes our work for the day. Thank you very much. All right. All four of y'all.